Hey guys, got a game I want to share with you just for pure enjoyment. I'm not feeling 100% today. I had too much port to drink last night. It was Christmas, so I've got my kids and my dad are coming over in a bit, but there's nothing to wake you up and put a spring in your step better than completely crushing your opponent. So I have a game that I would like to share, and it starts with d4, so my preferred response here is to play the Black Lion. And you can see the same moves come up again and again and again. Okay, so d4, d6, now c4, and I play my standard moves. The knights start to come out, knight to c3, knight over, and then e5. And he pushes the pawn forward, which is what I like to see. And all these are my standard moves up to this point. So now he brings his bishop out. And I push c6. This is the normal move at this point. And brings his knight out. And the next move is normally to put your queen on c7, where it's helping to defend the pawn on e5. But I decide to put the question to the bishop. What is your intention? I noticed that because white has already played c4, it's leaving this queen side of the board very open and exposed. So I'm thinking if he's going to castle, he's definitely going to castle short on the king side. So I decide to ask the question of the bishop, and the bishop captures, and now is one of the key moves. I've got 3 pieces that can capture, but because I'm anticipating my opponent castling and putting his king on g1, how do I capture? Well, I take with the pawn, I take with my g pawn. So I've left myself an isolated pawn. I've got double pawns on the f file now, but this is all about attacking. This is all about crushing my opponent. Okay, bishop comes out, so he's preparing to castle. Okay, if I were white at this point, I would be thinking twice. I'd have second thoughts about castling kingside. So now I start to maneuver my knight round. I want to bring my knight to here and then here, where it can take part in the attack. And he goes ahead and castles. So he's going to put his king right on a semi-open file when I've got a rook there lurking, waiting to jump onto that file. So in comes the knight. Now he moves his rook to one side, and I put my rook on g8. Okay, and really from this point, white is on the ropes for the entire game. Okay, and I've used less than a minute of my time so far. One of the advantages of knowing your opening system. Okay, now knight comes in. You can see the g2 pawn is pinned, right? And this is important. Bishop comes back to protect the pawn, because obviously otherwise I could have captured with the knight or with the rook, but the pawn is still pinned. Therefore I bring in another piece. My bishop dives in, and now the knight comes back in an attempt to defend the pawn. I actually noticed that there was a better move, that instead of bringing my bishop in at this point, there was a far sexier move to play, but I do actually get to play it. So I bring my bishop back because I want to play my awesome move. And can you see this combination? It's just 2 moves, right? But it's completely forcing. And it's the key is the fact that this pawn is still pinned by the rook, right? It's an absolute pin. That pawn cannot capture here, cannot capture here. Okay, so the move starts with, right, so white moves, then I play, and I'm really happy to see this, that he's allowed me to play it. So knight to h3, check. The king cannot move, the pawn cannot capture, so the next move is forced. The king has to go to g1, and now boom, knight takes f2, check, with a fork on the king and the queen. Disastrous. So I capture the queen, white recaptures, and now, I just want to simplify, so I grab the knight, and now it's an exercise in assuring the victory. Okay, I'm significantly ahead in material. So I have a queen for a knight, and I think I've still got all my pawns on the board. Yes, I do. So I'm well up in material. So the point here is to lock down the game and really just make my opponent suffer, simplify the board. So I castle here, he moves a rook across, I bring my rook out. Remember, he's got a light square bishop, so I need to be thinking about putting my pieces onto dark squares as much as possible to neutralize the impact of that bishop. He brings his knight around, I double up my rooks. Rook comes back to defend the pawn again on g2. Very, very key pawn here. And you can see that all of white's troubles were a result of, I think, rashly castling kingside. He'd have been so much safer over this side of the board, despite the fact that, you know, he's already pushed his c-pawn. But it really was just folly to do that. So bishop comes in, defending pawns. Now I come in with my queen. I'm attacking 2 pawns here. Grab a pawn, attacks the rook, attacks the bishop, rook grabs a pawn, and this is a decent move. So a knight comes to there with a discovered attack on the queen and defending the b3 pawn at the same time. So I just bring my queen back. So I'm starting to think about maybe coming in here. This diagonal towards the king looks good. Rook comes in now with a skewer on the queen, so this wins a pawn. But I'm not too concerned. It did cross my mind. I did have a think about whether I should trade my queen for that rook, but then I thought, no, I need to practice the discipline of crushing my opponent, okay, when I'm winning. I've played 4 or 5 games today, and I was ahead in all of them. But 2, I lost, even though I was, you know, in the lead. So I really, really do need to focus myself personally on winning from a winning position. So this is me practicing that. Okay, rook comes back, and now I start to maneuver my bishop round because I really want to be able to put my bishop here, right? Because I realised that if my bishop can get to e3 there with check, the king can't move to these squares because of the rook. So the only move he's got is to block with the rook because he can't. The rook's in the way. So then I would win the rook. Bishop comes round, and now he attacks my queen, right? But if you can counterattack with check, then you're safe. Okay. So I counterattack with check. The king cannot move, so he has to block either with the rook or with the knight. He blocks with the knight, so I just take it off the board. Very happy to simplify. And now comes a really nice sequence as well. So I come in with my queen, right? The next move is forced, okay? And this is a really, really satisfying exchange, because it's using the tactical principle of removing the defender. The king is the defender of the rook, and I'd actually calculated this in advance. So when I play now rook to h1, the king can't move because it would be in check, so the king has to capture the rook, and then I capture that rook with check. So we exchange the rooks, but I also win the bishop. Lovely, lovely, very, very satisfying conclusion. So only a couple more moves played, really. He brings his rook up, and now I'm starting to target this weak pawn that really has just been the target for the entire game, and you know, a real problem for white. And it all comes from this capture, when I decided to capture that bishop with my pawn rather than any other piece, right? Opening up that file and starting to make life very, very difficult. Okay, so he plays one more, and then he didn't notice that I was attacking the rook, so he loses his rook, and there we go. I only lost 1 pawn in the whole game. Extremely satisfying attack, and clearly it's entirely lost now for white. But yeah, all comes from a bad decision at the beginning. And you know, looking at the timings, you know, white really, the move 11 was the first move where he spent more than 13 seconds, right? And I pushed there, and he makes his next move with 3 seconds, 2 seconds now, and he decides to swap off. And I'd already decided that I was going to recapture with a pawn. But really, from this point, when you've got the threat of the semi-open file, guys, just do not put your king on that file. It's as simple as that. I mean, he could have fought on. Material is equal at this point. He could have maybe castled to the queen side, or he could have just not castled at all and focused on building his pawn structure, But it really was the beginning of the end, all the way down here, when he castles on move 10, and from that point it was only going to go one way. So there you go, lovely, satisfying game. Wanted to share it with you. Hope you're having a great time as well and enjoying your chess. See you later.